The readings today, we hear about people on the extremes, I suppose you could say. We hear, for instance, about these 4 young men who were among the Jewish exiles of noble blood and handsome and with all their abilities and everything. And we hear about how they were 10 times smarter than everybody else. Now, we do know, even if we look at it today, that the Jewish people are the highest or most intelligent people as a group in the world. And so, on one hand, that's not unusual. But what we are hearing about, however, are 4 young men who are rather extraordinary, even among the Jewish people. And so we hear about these guys who are above the rest. And then we hear about this widow in the gospel reading. And the widow has nothing. And so we hear about the great ones and we hear about the little ones. In this case, the great ones are also exiles. They're put into the king's service, yes, but they are exiles nonetheless. And the question in each of these situations ultimately comes down to whether we're willing to serve the Lord. Now, for these wealthy people we hear about in the gospel, that's kind of easy because they're just giving from their surplus. So they can go along, they can give lip service to God, they can give some of their money to God. It doesn't really cost them a whole lot. We hear about these 4 young men, and they're going to decide to serve the Lord in a pagan country when the king has already determined what they're going to be doing, and they take the risk of saying, I don't want to defile myself, I don't want to do something against the law of God. Can you take away the food and just bring us vegetables and water? They could have gotten themselves in a lot of trouble and probably at that point would have been killed. But thankfully, the Chamberlain was merciful toward them, was willing to try this, and it worked out well. And you see how God blessed them because of their fidelity. That all the graces that were given to them, that yes, they had obviously some great intellectual ability, but nonetheless, to be able to learn all of these things that they learned and to be able to enter into the king's service, do all these things, God blessed them because of their humility, because of their fidelity. In the same way, God blessed this poor widow because of her fidelity, because of her humility. And it's important for us to be able to look at that because all of us, obviously, have various states in life, calls, whatever you want to say, certainly differing abilities. There may be some here who are fairly wealthy and some here who are relatively poor. There are people here who have great intellectual gifts and others may not be so gifted that way, but they have gifts in other ways. And you have to understand that God is going to work with you according to your situation. Anybody looking at these 4 young men in the first reading would be able to recognize that they're pretty extraordinary young men. And that's why they were chosen for what they were doing. Nobody would have said that about this widow, except Jesus did. And isn't he the only one that matters? Nobody else would have noticed. She was just living her humble life. Poor, humble, nothing. And yet the Lord recognized her for who she was and what she did. And that's again important for all of us to recognize. When you look at your own situation, you have to understand that God is going to hold you responsible for what you are doing with what he has given to you. These 4 young men were given immense gifts and abilities, intellectual abilities and so on. They were going to be held responsible for what they did with that, just as you and I will be. And so look at the gifts that God has given. What we tend to do is try to size ourselves up in comparison to somebody else. There's no one you can compare yourself to because you're the only one who has what God has given to you. So the only way you can look is to look at the Lord and ask, am I being faithful to the Lord? Am I showing myself trustworthy with what he has given to me? Am I being generous with the gifts that the Lord has provided in the duties of my state in life, whatever those may be? For instance, God may give to a nun in a contemplative monastery extraordinary intellectual ability. She's not going to be out teaching in a college classroom. And it might look like she's not using the gifts that God has given her, but if she's using those in the duties of her state in life, then she is indeed doing exactly what God is asking her to do with all the ability she has. Sometimes, again, with obedience in a monastery, if the superior just simply says, I want you to wash the floors, it's like, but I could be a college professor. It's like, yep, I just want you to wash the floors. If that nun is obedient, God is going to bless her. You could say, but she's not using all the talent and ability she's got. She's being obedient to the duties of her state in life. So again, we have to be careful as we look at these different things to say, what is God calling me to? For every last one of us, he's calling us to humility. He's calling us to charity. Because every last one of us is being called to be a saint. Every one of us is called to holiness. That is across the board. Now, if God has put you in exalted circumstances, you're going to be responsible for that. If God has put you in very humble circumstances, you're going to be responsible for that. Because there are people in exalted circumstances who pride gets in the way. They think they're better than others. They look down on others, whatever. There are people in humble circumstances who don't want to be there and are angry and are fighting it. They're bitter because of their circumstances. That's why the Lord calls those blessed who are poor in spirit, not necessarily just because they're poor. So we have to look at what's going on inside. We have to look at what God is asking of us. And always to remember that God's going to look at what he has given us and how we've used it. We tend to look at what somebody has done compared to what we have done. It's a false comparison. We say if God has given the person sitting next to you the ability that's equal to, say, a 55-gallon drum, and he's given to you the ability of, a little thimble, and you look at what you've done with your little thimble compared to what that person's done, and let's say that person filled up their 55-gallon drum to 30 gallons, and you've got your little thimble. You say, oh, that person's done so much more than me. On one hand, yeah, they did. And God's going to look at it and say they did just a little more than half of what they had the ability to do. And if you filled up your little thimble, God's going to look at you and say, you've done 100% of what you had the ability to do. Well done, good and faithful servant. The other one's going to be in trouble for not using what God has given. We're looking at it and saying, oh, this one did so much. God's going to look at it and say, nope, they didn't, because they could have done so much more, and they didn't. So don't compare yourself to anybody. Just look at Jesus. Ask yourself, given my state in life, given the abilities that God has given me, what is he asking of me? And then work with it from there. It's all about seeking God's will. These 4 young men with their extraordinary talents, they had to seek God's will in their state in life. This poor widow, who seemingly had nothing, was blessed by God because she used everything that she had. So that's what matters. Receiving what God has given and using it in accordance with your state in life. Don't think I should be better than this. Don't think I should be. That's the wrong way of looking at it. That's our pride getting in the way. Just simply look at it and say, what is God asking of me right now? And am I using the talents and abilities according to my duties of my state in life as God would want me to do? If you are, then praise God, because you are doing exactly what he wants you to do. If you look at it and say, well, this is what I should be doing, but got all these things. I've got to scroll on my phone, and I've got to play computer games, and I've got to do all this stuff. Yeah, it's not going to go so well. So just look at Jesus, size it up, and strive with all that he's given to you, whatever that is, to be able to do what he's asking of you, and in that way to glorify him and to be blessed, because you have given to him all that you have.